Hi everyone, you're watching LTF1. My name is Richard Bailey. I'm the Chief Editor and founder of Motorsport M8.com, which is one of Australia's largest specialty motorsport websites, and we've been in operation since 2009.
Hey guys, welcome back to LTF1. Once again, we've got Richard on this week, and it's time for part 2 of our interview. If you've not seen part 1 already, then I'll link it in the card above me. But for now, let's get on with the interview. Weirdest time or weirdest story that you've had in the paddock? You've been there for a while, you must have.
Yeah, there were, there's been a few little scandals and the like that have emerged there. It's hard to probably pick a single event, but I'll probably highlight a couple at least. There was a strange one that kicked off, certainly of late. One of the weirder ones, and it was certainly tinged very much with sadness, was the passing of Charlie Whiting, the FIA race director, during the Australian Grand Prix weekend. That was quite an odd one because he was there on the on the Wednesday. A number of us had seen him, doing his usual inspections and safety briefings and compliance checks, and then Thursday he hadn't turned up. And when the news broke, it was late morning. We were getting ready to do the individual driver photos that are done at the start of pre-seasons. They can stand there in their race suits and their helmets and get the professional shots that then all go out to all the media folk. I think some of them land up ultimately being used in the grid graphics that come up at the start of every single race. But the news kind of broke through, and it was almost just this wave that just went across the paddock as the news spread. It was terribly sad. The FIA and Formula One management quickly pulled together a media briefing later that afternoon, so that the journalists could get a more complete and accurate picture as to what had happened. But it was a terribly, terribly sad weekend that had occurred. And at the same time, coincidentally, in that weekend was the Christchurch terrorist attack too. So that was, it was a real double whammy weekend, that particular one. But a couple of other weird ones that kicked around through. I remember there was another Australian Grand Prix weekend that we had where Sauber was in, Guido van der Garde was in a legal dispute with the Sauber team as to whether or not he was actually going to be driving the car that weekend. His argument was he had a valid contract, and anyway, it went through multiple legal proceedings in terms of who was actually going to be in the car that particular weekend. Ultimately, he sort of arranged a settlement off the side, but it was quite an ugly display. All up, it didn't reflect on the sport particularly well. It certainly didn't reflect on Sauber at all well, and it didn't reflect on Guido particularly well either. And he was a nice guy, but he was just fighting a battle he was never going to win from a contract recognition perspective, and it was not the best situation that would have occurred at the time. What was the other one? Yeah, I was at Malaysian Grand Prix. Would have been, I can't remember if it was 2013 or 2014, and sort of non-F1 related, but it did ultimately impact people, was that the media outlets were going to break the story that the Red Bull Racing Team principal Christian Horner had been having a long time affair with Jerry Halliwell at the time, now Jerry Horner. So there was much scrambling among certainly Christian's legal team to try and get the story buried, and I think that the press had played the game for long enough, and it was certainly a very open secret at that time that had been going on. Seemingly everyone knew except for poor Christian's wife, but certainly the story ultimately did land up breaking that weekend. They weren't able to argue on the grounds of privacy, and the tabloid outlets that did release the story were able to win on the grounds of a matter of public interest. I certainly don't think it was a matter of public importance, but certainly was a matter of public interest at the time.
Made for, I'm sure, an awkward team principals briefing and conference beforehand.
It did.
So you've been in the paddock, and it seems like quite a tight-knit community. But it also, for those of us and for fans that may have come into F1 through Drive to Survive, it seems like a very, very slick operation. Is that Netflix magic, or is the paddock truly an incredibly slick organization?
I think it depends venue to venue, to be honest. I've attended many Grand Prix across multiple countries. Without wanting to sound too parochial here, I think the Australian Grand Prix Corporation does a fantastic job at the organisation, the infrastructure that is set up. It's quite, the Melbourne paddock in particular is quite a cosy paddock. So there is generally a lot of mingling and that kind of thing that does tend to occur because it is a very tight setup. Singapore would be another example. I actually think that they moved most of the gear from Melbourne across to Singapore in terms of how they set it up. So when you've got those sort of smaller, more confined operations there, it is actually much easier to be able to network, to people watch, and to be able to gather and write really good stories and pieces there. From a physical setup element, it is done really well. When you look at the logistics that's required from a back-to-back weekends perspective, as soon as the checkered flag falls there, they are dismantling a huge number of that paddock setup so that it can get boxed up and moved straight on to the next operation. But while the Grand Prix weekend is in place, it is extremely tight from a security perspective. You are given a particular type of pass that will only allow you access to certain areas. So for the most part, certainly for print media and the like, there you are restricted in terms of you're allowed in the paddock and in the media centre. You cannot go into a team garage without invitation. You certainly can't get onto the pit lane from a safety perspective. The really long-standing journalists that do it full time, you might have seen on their passes, they've got a red coloured pass. I have a purple one, so that restricts me to certain pieces. The guys that have got the red coloured pass, that gives them pretty much all access. So they can head out onto the grid before the races, sometimes get into the garages and generally have a little bit more clout and treatment. But for the most part, from a journalist experience perspective, you are well looked after. But the teams, the general infrastructure is done really, really slickly. So I don't think Netflix in particular has got to do too much kind of dressing up. Certainly there's a lot of creative editing in the background that occurs. I think it's as far as manufacturing stories that aren't there. But from a visual setup, from an atmospheric perspective, it is done, it is a really, really slick, well-oiled machine.
And you spoke about the media and the teams kind of being separate at your paddock passes where you get to go. What are the teams, and maybe more specifically the drivers, like to work with and interact with?
It's a great question. It'll vary by team and it'll vary by driver. So the teams will, if you're lucky, and if you do a really good pitch to the teams, you might be able to secure a 10 or 15 minute one-to-one interview with a particular driver. We've been able to do lots of them over the years, but it's very much get in there and beg and plead, and you've got to state very clearly what your brief and what your angle is going to be, and the teams will ultimately hold you to that. So you might recall in a Drive to Survive, there was the incident that occurred with Alex Albon, where a journalist had not properly briefed the team as to what he was going after, and then started asking questions about Albon's mother's criminal history. And the press officer, very quickly shut that down and canned the interview. So it's very much you've got to show due respect and deference to the particular teams when you're trying to do that. Some teams will be great. It's a very open door setup and will be extremely helpful. I've got to say props over the course of my time. Teams like Williams, Alfa Romeo, I'd even put Renault into the mix there. And then, sadly, a couple of the non-existent teams, I've got to say, back in the day, the little minnows like HRT and Caterham in particular were fantastic, and really, really open to the media and made themselves extremely accessible. Your bigger operations, your Mercedes, your Ferraris, your Red Bulls and the like, good luck getting a one-to-one interview unless you hold a Sky, a credential or you are the senior editor at Autosport, you've got stuff all chance of being able to get any kind of decent access. So you will have the broad pen style access that's given, and they tend to separate the TV journalists and the print and web journalists, so you tend to get your own session. The teams do not work very well at coordinating the written media sessions so that each team runs at a different time. There tends to be a lot of overlap, so if you're running a single operation, you have to make trade-off decisions as to which team you ultimately land up going to try to go to be able to get the interview, get the audio, get the questions done. So yeah, it'll kind of depend on the culture and the setup of the team, and what their relationship happens to be like, with the media. I'd say that the stories of Ferrari in particular, their very poor relationship with the press, are completely true. Have softened very slightly in recent years, but I would certainly put them at the top of the list in terms of the most difficult to ultimately deal with, and to be able to get anything out of them. Others are much better, and similarly from a driver's perspective, you can have fantastic drivers who are genuinely wonderful to interview with and will really engage, and there will be other drivers where trying to get a decent interview out of them is like drawing blood from a stone, and it can be very frustrating, and you don't land up getting good copy to be able to work with.
Sounds like you're speaking from personal experience.
Very much.
With the last bit.
Very, very much.
Have you ever been on the receiving end of a team maybe saying, "Hey, Richard, that's a bit too far," or "Can you not speak about this? Can you take that out, not use it?"
I'm trying to think. No, I can't say that I have. I've generally approached, I've approached the teams respectfully. I've been very clear about the brief that I've gone into, that I'm bringing into a one-on-one interview. Generally I've found that if I can have and set up a good relationship with the press team, then you'll land up with good outcomes. There's a couple of keys to being successful as far as an interview is concerned with the driver. I would say if you're going there, and this is why many drivers and teams ultimately have their guard up there. If you're going in there with a tabloid mentality of, I'm going to try and stir controversy and grab a headline for the sake of doing so, and I very much put, the Daily Mail and the Mirror and the Sun in that bucket there. I don't think you're going to land up getting very far. I think if you're interested in, sort of genuine human stories, and you approach your drivers or your team figures, I think, honestly, if you're not going in there with a hidden agenda, you're probably going to land up getting more. Now, if they happen to then open their mouth and sort of say something stupid or something controversial, well, then that's on them, really. But, there's a general understanding that if you're going in there and you stuck the microphone in front of them there, they are on the record, and what's there is ultimately going to be used. Backgrounding off the record, slightly different topic. We've done certainly plenty of that, and that's really down to you've landed good relationships with particular drivers where you can kind of corner them off the record to sort of get particular pieces of information. But again, you've got to be careful with what you do and how you use that as well.
So speaking about the teams and their media operations, it's been wonderful to see this year that all the teams have embraced FOM's We Race as One branding and movement and attitude towards diversity and inclusion in the sport. But what is your take on the recent controversy and seemingly the stance of the FIA to wash their hands of a controversy and kind of just leave it to the teams when there is apparent homophobia and racism from particular quarters or particular people? It's a tricky one there. I think for the individual in question, a young Russian driver, son of a certainly highly controversial chemical tycoon, I think everyone can figure out who we're referencing.
he certainly had he's got form, let's put it that way. None of his behaviour should honestly come as a surprise. Now, does that excuse this behaviour? Absolutely not. It becomes tricky there in terms of what the FIA as the governing body and FOM can, Formula One management is able to do as far as stamping that behaviour out and pushing it through to the teams. Certainly, this young driver in question is not, he's the most obvious candidate, I think, to be looking at. Is he the only one? Absolutely not. The paddock overall, and I'd say this from a media perspective, but also just a broader operations in terms of how the teams operate and look and conduct themselves and where it's evolved. Has it become less of a cultural monolith? Yes. Does it have a long way to go to be able to get into a much more diverse and inclusive environment? Absolutely. There is still sexism, racism, homophobia in that paddock environment. Absolutely. It's perhaps not as overt as it was maybe a couple of years ago, but it does bubble there under the surface. So I think it's really just a case of the people need to call it out, speak out about it, and I applaud Hamilton, Lewis Hamilton, for being at the front of being able to do that and champion that effort. He is absolutely the right spokesperson to do that and lead that and drive that change, and I think really hold many teams and the broader operation accountable for creating that cultural shift and bringing it to the forefront. The elements around certain drivers refusing quite persistently to take a knee, I think it's disappointing. You've got to strike the right balance in terms of, freedom of expression and opinion, but I kind of go, it's a simple enough gesture to be able to do it. And I think that the likes of some drivers in particular not to take a knee and may say, they may talk the talk, but it's not necessarily translating from an actions perspective is disappointing. Do I expect a Daniel Kvyat, for example, to take a knee from a racism perspective, given his cultural and national background? Absolutely not. Am I making an excuse for him on that ground? Absolutely not. So it's really just the sport ultimately has a long way to go, but I think that it is progressing there slowly and surely. I think that the other issue to ultimately look at, but again, I don't know if I've got concrete answers for that, is the whole aspect of sport washing that is occurring in terms of where races are ultimately landing up being staged. There is, I think, a huge perception problem that you create as an organization when you are staging races in countries like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, like Azerbaijan, where you are going to countries that are prepared to stump up the money, to create ultimately good PR, in countries that have next to no motorsport pedigree whatsoever, that carry on very much in a nothing to see here kind of piece. I think, though, if you were to apply the same standards as far as social justice and inclusion and protection of human rights, etc., I think honestly we would struggle to find any country currently on the calendar that doesn't have some questionable element to them. So you then kind of create, without wanting to sound hypocritical there, it's like, well, where's that line in the sand that gets drawn? And to what standard do you ultimately apply? Does a Formula One race ultimately drive social change and justice? I can't really say I've seen a great deal of evidence for that. But there were instances in the past, if you think about South Africa in the 80s in the apartheid regime, where the FIA pulled out and said, we are not staging a race in South Africa anymore because of the apartheid regime. And it was part of the bigger, broader global push that drove the country to eventually become free and democratic. So the broader question becomes, well, what's changed over the course of 35 years? That standard that was set in the mid-1980s doesn't seem to apply and exist, despite arguably equally poor human rights records and treatment that are occurring in a number of these other countries. It's a challenge that the sport needs to address, and I don't know what the answer is and ultimately what path they're going to head, particularly when money talks to the extent that it does today.
Exactly. And for everyone watching, if you want to comment what you think about the We Race as One movement and what you think F1 and FOM should be doing. But on that note, again, it's been wonderful talking to you, Richard. You bring a lot of insight that we wouldn't otherwise have on this channel through your years of experience. So thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Look forward to being on again soon.
Hopefully. And for the viewers, if you've liked this video, then share it, subscribe. It shows us that you like our content and we should keep producing things like this. But yeah, that's all for now.